The hall of St. Peter's Basilica had never felt heavier. Marble pillars that had stood for centuries seemed to lean forward, listening, waiting. The vaulted ceiling, painted with scenes of heaven, arched above in solemn witness, as though eternity itself had bent low to observe what was about to unfold. The world was watching, and every breath in that room carried the tension of centuries of tradition balanced on the edge of a single moment. The press conference had begun like many before it, the shuffling of papers, the clicking of cameras, the nervous coughs of reporters who traveled oceans to sit in those rows. They had come with questions, but not with reverence. For them, this was theater, a global spectacle, and they had already rehearsed the headlines they would run by evening. They were waiting, not to hear, but to catch. Not to understand, but to trap. From the second row, it came, sharp, impatient, cutting through the cathedral air like a blade tearing through silk. A journalist, Marcus Valdez, raised his voice before his peers had steadied their pens. His tone was bold, almost mocking, as if he were addressing not the Pope of Rome, but an accused witness on trial. His words were designed not as inquiry but as accusation. Your Holiness, are you rewriting the very foundation of the Mass? The question slammed into the air. It was not merely a question. It was a provocation, a challenge, a gauntlet hurled at the feet of the Church itself. The journalists froze in place. Their pens paused mid-stroke. Their eyes darted to the Pontiff. Some expected a polite dismissal, others a theological deflection. A few smirked, their confidence rising, already tasting the scandal that would secure their headlines. Silence followed. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of something weighty, something ancient. It pressed down upon the shoulders of those present like a mantle too heavy to bear. The crowd leaned forward. A senator in the back row straightened his jacket, as though bracing for a thunderclap. The question had been asked, and all that remained was the answer. Pope Leo XIV lifted his head. His face was calm, his eyes clear, as though he had expected this very moment. He did not rush. He did not defend. He did not lash out. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, to deepen, to turn the room itself into a vessel of anticipation. In that pause, history seemed to hesitate. The centuries of tradition, the Mass spoken in Latin, the prayers whispered over bread and wine, the chants echoing in cathedrals, all of it seemed to hold its breath, waiting to know whether it would endure or be reshaped. Finally, with the composure of a man who had walked among ruins, who had knelt beside the dying and comforted the broken, the Pope opened his lips. His voice was steady, low, yet commanding enough to still every camera shutter, to still every restless movement in the pews. And he said words that no one expected, words that pierced through the centuries like lightning across a night sky. Yes. The Mass will change. The room cracked open. Gasps rose like a storm breaking against cliffs. Some reporters dropped their pens. Flashbulbs exploded in frantic stutters. One woman clutched her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her palm. A senator at the edge of the gathering shook his head, his mouth tightening in disbelief. It was not just an answer, it was a confession, a declaration, a trumpet blast that reverberated against marble and glass. Whispers ignited across the room. Did he just say that? Did the Pope himself say the Mass will change? Skepticism turned to shock, shock to outrage, outrage to fascination. The journalists were no longer writing, they were staring, transfixed, as though they had just seen a wall of the Vatican collapse with a single sentence. The Pope remained still. He did not tremble beneath the weight of their stares. His calm was a rebuke to their frenzy. He had not hesitated. He had not cloaked his answer in ambiguity. He had spoken with clarity, and clarity is more dangerous than silence. Marcus Valdez blinked. For the first time in his career, the words he had prepared, the snare he had laid, slipped from his grasp. His face betrayed it, a momentary flicker of surprise, then disbelief, then something bordering on fear. He had expected resistance, theological hedging, maybe even outrage. But he had not expected surrender that looked like victory. The basilica itself seemed to react. The air grew heavier, as though the stone walls carried the echo of the Pope's words, repeating them back to every ear. Yes. The Mass will change. Some felt it as a betrayal, others as liberation. But none could deny the weight. The moment itself was no longer about question or answer. It had become prophecy, declaration, rupture. And yet, even in that rupture, there was no anger in his eyes. The Pope did not look like a man tearing something down. He looked like one carrying a secret too long buried, revealing it at last, not to destroy but to transform. His gaze moved across the hall, meeting the eyes of his challengers, his doubters, his faithful. And though his lips did not move further, his silence carried a message as clear as any sermon: you may resist, but you cannot unhear what has been spoken. The audience at home felt it too. Across continents, in living rooms, cafes, and cathedrals, millions watched the live broadcast, frozen. Some leaned forward toward their screens, eyes wide, hearts racing. Others recoiled, shaking their heads in disbelief. On social media, the first clips began to circulate, for words clipped, replayed, dissected, yes. The Mass will change. But the moment was not finished. Because what Pope Leo XIV spoke next did not merely answer a question, it shook the very idea of what the Church was, what it had been, and what it would become. It was not defense, it was declaration. Not retreat, but advance. It was the unveiling of something that would divide believers across the world, ignite debates in cathedrals and living rooms, and force every soul to decide where they stood. And so the narrator's voice, heavy with reverence and tension, presses upon the listener. What he said next shook the world. Before the story unfolds, the question is turned gently to you, the witness of this moment. Where do you stand as history bends? What land are you watching from as the earth beneath the Church shifts? Speak now, for silence itself becomes confession. And if you believe that the Mass, the holy center of faith, is too sacred to be tampered with, then stand with us. Subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, and anchor yourself to truth that does not bend to the age. But if you will not, then let your refusal be known in the open. Write in the comments why you choose to remain silent while others bear witness. The world held its breath in the wake of the Pope's words. Yes. The Mass will change. The silence that followed was not empty but alive, charged, stretching out across continents, seeping into living rooms, sanctuaries, and parliaments. But for those who listened with depth, this moment did not arise from nowhere. To understand the weight of what was spoken, one had to look behind the gilded robes and beyond the marble pillars, to the man who now stood at the center of history. Leo had not begun as Pope Leo XIV. He had begun as Giovanni di Luca, a boy from a mountain village so small it could barely be found on maps. He was the son of a shoemaker and a seamstress, growing up in a home where bread was hard-earned and prayer was the only inheritance worth passing on. The villagers remembered him as a quiet child, often found sitting beneath olive trees with a tattered Bible on his knees, tracing the words with a finger as though each one carried fire. He was no stranger to hardship. As a boy, he buried a sister lost to fever, a brother taken by accident in the fields. His early encounters with suffering carved into him not bitterness, but a strange tenderness, a willingness to sit with pain and not turn away. It was this tenderness that carried him beyond his village, first to seminary, then to war-torn lands where the cry of the poor was louder than the songs of the rich. He served in refugee camps where hunger hollowed out children's eyes. He lifted the dying from rubble after airstrikes silenced whole neighborhoods. He whispered prayers over graves dug hurriedly in sand. Those who worked alongside him said he carried himself with disarming simplicity. He wore the same patched cassock for years, shared his bread with strangers, and preferred the company of the wounded to the banquets of dignitaries. In him burned an odd paradox: humility deep enough to kneel before beggars, and strength firm enough to face tyrants without blinking. This was the man who, decades later, would sit upon the chair of Peter. And it was precisely this past that made his declaration that day unbearable to some and undeniable to others. For this was not a pope insulated in ivory towers. This was a man who had walked among ruins, who had kissed the foreheads of orphans, who had prayed in basements where bombs fell overhead. When he spoke with the weight of one who had not only read the gospel but lived it in blood and dust. Across the hall, his challenger carried a very different story. Marcus Valdez was not born to obscurity. His name had been known in newsrooms before he was 30. Award-winning, sharp, fearless, these were the titles pinned to him. He had built his reputation by cornering politicians, exposing scandals, and pulling apart institutions with the pen of skepticism. To Marcus, faith was not sacred, it was a veil behind which power hid. Religion, in his eyes, was theater for the weak, manipulated by the cunning. He had grown up in a world of glass towers and modern ideals. His education was not forged by famine or war but by debates in halls where applause was currency. He believed in reason, evidence, and the triumph of human intellect. And with this belief came an arrogance that others mistook for confidence. He had exposed bishops for corruption, unearthed cover-ups that shook dioceses, and prided himself on piercing the armor of men who claimed divine authority. For Marcus, this day was an opportunity, perhaps the pinnacle of his career. To question the Pope directly, to catch him in contradiction, to reduce his authority before the eyes of the world, this was the prize he had sought. But when the Pope spoke with such clarity, Marcus felt something he had not prepared for, the ground beneath him shifted. He had expected hedging, evasion, perhaps even outrage. He had not expected surrender that sounded like sovereignty. The clash between these two men was not accidental. It was the collision of two worlds. On one side, a pope shaped by dust, war, and prayer, on the other, a journalist sharpened by skepticism, ambition, and applause. On one side, humility that had nothing to prove, on the other, arrogance that needed victory to survive. The stage for their encounter was no ordinary press room. St. Peter's Basilica had been transformed into a global broadcast arena. Cameras circled like watchful eyes, beams of light fell across ancient stone, and screens transmitted every pause, every blink, to millions. Pilgrims who once knelt to pray now sat as spectators. The basilica's grandeur, its mosaics and towering columns, no longer seemed timeless but trembling, as though unsure of the role they now played in this drama. The sacred had been turned into spectacle, and the world leaned in. And the stakes could not have been higher. For 15 centuries, the liturgy had stood like an unbroken chain. Its words, gestures, and rhythms had bound together peasants and kings, martyrs and emperors, across time and continents. To alter it was not merely to change a ritual, it was to touch the DNA of the Church. Some saw it as liberation, others as betrayal, but all understood it as rupture. The faithful feared division. Politicians saw opportunity. Skeptics predicted collapse. The world did not agree on much, but on this they agreed, nothing would remain the same. Within the basilica, this tension condensed into the figures of two men, the Pope and the journalist. One clothed in white, the other in sharp black. One with lines of age etched by sorrow, the other with the smooth confidence of youth. One carrying silence like a shield, the other wielding words like weapons. It was contrast embodied. And in this contrast lay the drama that now unfolded, not merely between two men, but between two visions of reality. Was faith a relic to be dissected by intellect, or was it a flame that endured beyond logic's reach? Was authority a mask for power, or a burden carried for the sake of the weak? Was the Mass a museum piece, or a living fire that demanded renewal? As the world debated, the Pope stood unmoved. His calm was not detachment but conviction. His stillness was not weakness but strength. Marcus shifted in his seat, sensing that his opponent was not playing by the rules of modern confrontation. Here was a man who did not fear headlines. Here was a man who did not measure himself by applause. And the narrator's voice, aligned with the weight of the moment, presses upon the listener. this was not merely a press conference, it was a battlefield of ideas, a contest of spirits. The Pope and the journalist stood as archetypes, humility against arrogance, faith against doubt, simplicity against spectacle. The air itself trembled as if heaven leaned down to hear which voice would prevail. If you are listening now, you are part of this moment. You are a witness to history unfolding. You cannot sit neutral on the edges of such a clash. You must decide where you stand. If truth spoken with humility still matters to you, subscribe to Circles of God's Glory and take your stand with those who will not remain silent. But if you will not, then write in the comments why you choose hesitation while others commit. This was the stage. This was the contrast. This was the weight of the moment that prepared the world for what was to come. The silence that followed the Pope's declaration had weight, but silence is never eternal. It is always broken by the voice of those who believe they have found an opening. Marcus Valdez, though shaken by the Pope's unexpected clarity, was too seasoned to retreat. He straightened in his chair, smoothed his notes with trembling fingers disguised as steady ones, and leaned once more into the microphone. His tone, this time, carried a veil of respect. Measured, formal, as if cloaked in politeness, but beneath it was the familiar edge of a trap waiting to be sprung. Your Holiness, he began, his voice carefully pitched to carry to every corner of the basilica, surely you understand the gravity of such words. For centuries, the faithful have drawn strength from a Mass unchanged, a ritual rooted in the very heart of the Church. Why now? Why alter what has endured for so long? Is this about faith, or is it about bending to the politics of modern times? The question floated into the cavernous space like incense, sweet to some, suffocating to others. Reporters nodded, grateful for the articulation of what they themselves had scribbled in hurried shorthand. Viewers at home sat forward in their seats, sensing that here lay the real confrontation. Marcus had framed the issue not as one of theology, but of betrayal, of compromise. It was a question designed to slice through piety and expose, as he believed, the machinery of power beneath. But the Pope did not rush. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though gathering not arguments but memories. When he opened them, his voice emerged with the calm of a man who had nothing to fear from honesty. Tradition, he said slowly, is a living tree. Cut off its roots, and it dies. But leave it untouched, never pruned, never watered, and it also withers. Tradition without life is a museum. And the Church, my son, was not called to be a museum. The basilica stilled again. The answer was not defensive. It did not sidestep. It reframed. Those words carried the paradox of preservation and renewal, the balance that Marcus had hoped to fracture. Instead of appearing reckless, the Pope appeared as a gardener tending to something alive, something sacred, something that must breathe. Marcus's brow furrowed. He pressed on quickly, unwilling to surrender ground. But if faith is eternal, as you claim, then why touch its expression? Why disturb what believers have carried across generations? Is this not a concession to relevance, a surrender to the spirit of the age? The Pope's eyes softened. Faith is not bound by form, he replied, but fueled by fire. The fire of love, the fire of truth, the fire of sacrifice. The words we speak, the gestures we perform, they are vessels. They must remain strong enough to carry the flame, yet humble enough to serve it. If the vessel cracks, the flame flickers. But if the vessel becomes the object of worship, the flame itself dies. Do not mistake the container for the treasure. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily. A few reporters scribbled down the metaphor, though without grasping its depth. Yet for those listening with open hearts, the image was piercing. The Mass, the ritual, was not the destination but the vehicle. To honor it meant to ensure it remained faithful to what it carried, not merely to guard its shell. Marcus felt the subtle shift. His question had been turned, redirected from suspicion to vision. He tried again, searching for sharper edges. But Your Holiness, he said, his voice quickening, How do you answer those who will claim this is less about the flame of faith and more about appeasing the politics of modern society? Do you not see that by altering the Mass, you give power to those who mock it, who will twist it as a sign of weakness? The Pope leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, his voice carried a weight that pressed down like a mantle. The politics of men are rivers that dry in summer and flood in spring. The gospel is the ocean. It does not bow to tides of culture, it carries them. If men mock us, let them. If they twist, let them twist. The truth does not weaken because others misinterpret it. The truth is Christ crucified, Christ risen, Christ among the poor. If the Mass does not point to him, then it is nothing but words. But if it points to him clearly, then let the world rage. We will endure. It was not an answer Marcus could dismantle with ease. It did not sound like concession. It sounded like clarity. The Pope had not denied the charge of relevance, but he had stripped it of power. What Marcus framed as compromise, the Pope revealed as conviction. The audience reaction split visibly. Some shook their heads in quiet resistance, their lips pressed thin with suspicion. To them, the Pope's words were dangerous, reckless, a betrayal dressed as poetry. Others leaned forward with tears in their eyes, sensing in his answers not weakness but faith deepened, purified, tested in fire. On social media, the live broadcast began to erupt. Some typed in fury, "This is heresy. The Pope is dismantling the Church." Others whispered through keyboards, "Finally, a voice that sees beyond politics." And above it all, the Pope's stillness stood like a lighthouse. His deflections were not evasions but redirections, turning every trap into an opportunity to speak of unity, of Christ, of the eternal flame. He had not argued, he had reoriented. He had not defended himself, he had defended the heart of the Church. Marcus felt the audience slipping. He saw reporters who once smiled with him now pausing, considering. He tightened his grip on the microphone, preparing to sharpen his next strike. But beneath his rehearsed confidence, something unsettled him. The Pope's words did not sound like strategy. They sounded like truth. And truth has a way of unraveling even the strongest armor of cynicism. The narrator's voice settles upon the audience, reminding them, this is only the beginning. The confrontation had not yet reached its height. The traps were only being laid. The tension was only stretching its bowstring. But already, the first cracks had appeared in the challenger's certainty, and the first seeds of division had been sown among those who listened. If you hear these words and they resonate with you, if you feel the weight of wisdom clothed in simplicity, then subscribe to Circles of God's Glory. Do not watch as a spectator only. Stand with those who seek the flame above the vessel. But if you will not, then write in the comments why you prefer silence, so that your refusal will stand as your testimony. The words of the Pope had stilled the basilica, but stillness does not last. It was Marcus who moved next, shifting in his chair, narrowing his eyes, and gathering the fragments of his composure. The trap he had set had not snapped as he intended, but the hunger for a headline drove him forward. He leaned into the microphone, his tone sharpening like a blade tested again on stone. "Your Holiness," he said, with the air of one speaking on behalf of many, "is this not just bending to culture? Is this not the Church bowing its head before the world, diluting the faith to win applause from those who never believed in the first place? Tell us plainly, are you seeking holiness, or are you chasing popularity?" The question was venom wrapped in silk. It carried the accusation that had simmered beneath every headline, whispered in every skeptical pew, muttered in every parliament. The Pope had spoken of flame and vessel, of truth unchained from form, but Marcus was striking at motive. To question motive is to question integrity. And in that question, he sought to strip away the Pope's authority, to show him not as a shepherd but as a politician. The basilica shifted. Reporters leaned closer. Cameras tightened their focus. The faithful who watched from around the world clenched their hands, whispering prayers or curses depending on their allegiance. The Pope did not flinch. He waited, as though letting the venom lose some of its sting in the open air before answering. When he spoke, his voice no longer floated like a soft stream but carried the firmness of a river's current. Politics divides. The gospel unites. The word struck not with volume but with gravity. The Pope did not argue about culture. He did not debate relevance. He spoke a truth that echoed deeper: the schemes of men tear communities apart, but the message of Christ binds them together. The simplicity of the line unsettled Marcus more than a paragraph of defense could have. Still, Marcus pressed on, his tone sharpening further, almost trembling with the urgency to regain control. But surely you see that every change has political consequence. Surely you know that those outside the Church will seize this as proof that you are surrendering the sacred for the approval of the world. How then can you claim this is about faith alone? The Pope's eyes lifted toward the crucifix that loomed above the basilica. He allowed his silence to stretch long enough that it became an answer in itself. And then, with a voice steady but deepened by memory, he began not with argument but with story. I once stood in a refugee camp where the air reeked of sickness and the ground was lined with tents that could not keep out the rain. A mother brought me her child, a boy no older than 5, his body thin as reeds, his breath shallow. She asked me to baptize him before death took him. I poured water into my hand and spoke the words. No cathedral. No organ. No incense. Only dust, tears, and hope. Tell me, my son, was that Mass less holy because it was not spoken in marble halls? Was it diluted because it bent to the hunger of the moment? The basilica fell into silence again, but this silence was not the same as before. This was the silence of a wound opening in the conscience. The Pope's gaze moved across the room, meeting eyes one by one. I have stood at the bedsides of the dying, whispering the words of consecration while bombs thundered outside. I have broken bread in cellars where widows wept for husbands buried in rubble. I have seen the Mass spoken in fear, in hunger, in despair, and in those moments, it was not diluted. It was fire. It was light in darkness. It was Christ among his people. So no, Marcus. This is not about bending to culture. This is about ensuring the flame still burns where the world seeks to extinguish it. The journalist hesitated. His face betrayed the flicker of unease he could not suppress. He had expected answers framed in policy, theology, or strategy. But what he received were stories drenched in human suffering, in truth too raw to be dismissed as rhetoric. Still, Marcus would not yield. He forced a tight smile, his voice steady but his words laced with accusation. But surely, Holy Father, you must see how this appears. To the faithful, to the devout, it looks like compromise. It looks like a betrayal of the very thing that has stood against centuries of change. Can you not see that in reaching for the world, you risk losing the Church itself? The Pope lowered his head, then raised it again, his eyes filled not with anger but with a piercing sadness. His voice carried both firmness and tenderness, a rebuke clothed in compassion. What is the Church, if not the body of Christ? And what did Christ do, if not step into a world that mocked him, scorned him, crucified him? To reach for the world is not betrayal. It is obedience. It is the heart of the gospel itself. The shepherd does not guard tradition by locking the sheep in a pen. He guards it by walking into the wilderness to bring them home. And if that wilderness speaks a new tongue, then the shepherd will speak it too. For love bends not to politics, but to the cry of the lost. The wave had risen. Marcus had sharpened his accusations, but the Pope's answers had not been dulled, they had grown sharper in a different way. The wave now broke into tenderness, the firmness softening into compassion. The Pope's voice quieted. Do not mistake my words, Marcus. The Mass will not be emptied of its heart. It will not be traded for applause. It will not be corrupted by politics. It will, however, breathe anew, so that the flame may continue to light the path of generations. That is not dilution. That is faithfulness. The basilica exhaled. Some eyes were wet with tears. Others burned with suspicion. But no one was indifferent. The confrontation had shifted from the intellectual to the personal, from politics to the gospel itself. And so the narrator's voice, aligned with the moral weight of the moment, lingers upon the listeners. Do you hear the difference? Do you feel the weight of stories lived in dust and blood, of truth carried not in palaces but in ruins? If wisdom resonates with you, then subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, that this flame may not be lost to noise and distraction. But if you will not, then write in the comments why you reject such words, so that your silence will not masquerade as neutrality. The wave had not finished. The questions would sharpen yet again, the conflict would deepen, but already the balance was shifting. The Pope's voice, calm yet firm, had revealed a strength that arguments alone could not shake. And the world leaned in closer, knowing the storm was only beginning. The basilica had grown tense, the weight of words heavy in the vaulted air. Every answer the Pope gave seemed to slip through Marcus's grasp like water through clenched fists. What had begun as careful traps disguised as polite inquiries had turned into sharper accusations, and yet the Pontiff's responses remained rooted, unshaken, carrying a kind of fire that did not shout but burned steadily. For Marcus, this was intolerable. He had built his reputation on shaking men of power, exposing weakness, unmasking hypocrisy. And yet here, in this hall where the cameras of the world watched, his sharpest blade seemed to dull against a figure who did not play by the rules of debate. He leaned forward, his face taut, his words spilling not with control but with desperation disguised as boldness. So you're a puppet for globalists, then? Marcus's voice was louder now, breaking the veneer of professional calm he had worn. The words rang against marble walls with an almost vulgar force. He did not ask, he accused. He did not probe, he declared. The audience stirred, some gasping at the audacity, others nodding as though finally someone had said what they themselves had whispered in shadows. The Pope did not move at once. His stillness grew heavier, pressing down on the frenzy like a hand calming the tremor of a child. When he did speak, his words carried a quiet fire, not loud, not theatrical, but a fire that scorched deeper because it did not need to rage. I have held dying children in my arms, he said. The sentence was simple, but its weight fell like stone into water, sending ripples through every heart present. The words dragged the conversation out of abstraction and thrust it into flesh and blood, into dust and death, into the kind of truth that cannot be debated away. The Pope's eyes, normally soft, now carried a sharp intensity. Do you call me a puppet because I bend to the cry of the poor? Do you call me a puppet because I listen to the widow, the orphan, the forgotten? You call it naive to defend innocence. I call it sacred. The basilica seemed to breathe all at once, as though thousands of souls inhaled together. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet the force of words that pierced past intellect into conscience. Others shifted in their seats, restless, angry, unable to accept such simplicity as an answer. Above, the light from chandeliers gleamed against ancient stone. It caught the edges of icons, glowed faintly against gilded frames, and bathed the Pope in a subtle radiance. To those watching in the room, it was as though heaven itself had leaned closer, illuminating the figure who stood unmoved under accusation. The cameras captured it. Screens across the world showed the same image. The Pontiff steady, calm, radiant in his quiet fire, while his challenger's composure cracked. Viewers at home divided as sharply as the crowd in the basilica. Some wept quietly, whispering prayers, feeling in their own hearts the truth of his words. Others scoffed, anger rising, convinced they were watching manipulation disguised as piety. The clash was no longer between two men but between two visions of reality itself. Marcus tried to press forward, but his voice betrayed him. His next word stumbled slightly, not because he had lost vocabulary, but because he had lost balance. But, surely you see that by taking this path, you are handing the Church over to forces that will twist it, that will use your changes to destroy it from within. The Pope's gaze did not waver. His tone deepened, not with anger, but with that restrained strength that carries more force than shouting. Do you believe the gospel is so fragile? Do you believe Christ himself can be dismantled by the noise of men? The church is not surrendered by listening to the cry of the world. The church is surrendered when it chooses silence in the face of that cry. I have seen the faces of children with no bread. I have seen the eyes of women with no hope. You think I stand here as a puppet? No, Marcus. I stand here as a witness. The words struck with the force of testimony, not debate. They were not theory. They were memory, lived and carried, turned into conviction. In that moment, Marcus's role as challenger began to look smaller, more brittle, as though his accusations could not bear the weight of such reality. The basilica was silent again, but this silence was sharper, more cutting. It was the kind of silence that follows a truth too heavy to brush aside, a silence that divides hearts between those who will bow and those who will harden. And the narrator's voice presses now upon the listeners, upon you who witness this clash across time and screen. Do you feel the weight of these words? Do you hear in them not rhetoric but reality, not compromise but conviction? If so, subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, that such truth may continue to reach you beyond the noise of politics and distraction. But if you will not, then write in the comments why you resist, so that your silence does not disguise itself as neutrality. For this was the turning point. The challenger had raised his voice, had cast his harshest accusations. But the Pope had stood unshaken, answering not with theory but with lived truth. And in that moment, the power dynamic flipped, arrogance began to unravel, and humility shone like fire. The storm had not ended, it was only at its peak, but in that peak, the world saw which man stood rooted, and which man trembled. The basilica held its silence like a wound, the echoes of the Pope's quiet fire still burning in the hearts of all who had heard him. Marcus Valdez sat stiff in his chair, his face betraying the strain of a man who had loosed his strongest arrows only to see them fall harmlessly before his target. His last accusation, bold as it was, had not struck the blow he expected. Instead, it had exposed something he had not prepared for, the immovable resolve of a man who had stared suffering in the face and refused to turn away. But Marcus could not relent. His career, his reputation, his very identity had been built on dismantling the powerful. He swallowed, straightened his back, and prepared to launch another challenge, this time framing it with even sharper skepticism. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice carrying the residue of frustration beneath the surface polish. Your Holiness, forgive me, but your words sound noble and compassionate, yet compassion is often the veil beneath which compromise hides. You speak of engaging with the world, of changing forms and vessels, but many hear it as surrender, as endorsement of forces that stand against the very truth you claim to defend. How do you separate engagement from endorsement? The basilica seemed to lean in. Even the air trembled with expectation. It was a question crafted to corner, to strip away the Pope's ability to claim purity. Marcus's eyes gleamed with a flicker of regained confidence. This was his realm, to blur lines, to show that even saints have shadows. But the Pope answered without haste, his voice measured, his tone devoid of defensiveness. You confuse engagement with endorsement, he said. The words were simple, yet they fell like hammers on stone. The contrast was clear. To step into darkness with a lamp is not to celebrate the darkness. To bind the wounds of the broken is not to bless the hand that struck them. Engagement is the mission of Christ himself, who sat with sinners, who touched lepers, who wept with mourners. Endorsement is to call sin virtue. Do not mistake one for the other. The journalists shifted in their seats. Some nodded faintly, struck by the sharp distinction. Others stared in silence, their pens frozen above their pages. The Pope did not stop. His voice grew firmer, deeper, though never rising in volume. Politics fades. Souls endure. You accuse me of bending to culture, of pandering to politics. But tell me, Marcus, which empire still rules? Where are the Caesars who demanded sacrifice to their gods? Where are the parliaments of old who thought themselves eternal? They have all turned to dust. But the soul of a child, the faith of a widow, the courage of a martyr, these endure. I do not shape the mass for politics. I shape it so that souls may live, so that Christ may be seen more clearly in every age. Politics is the shadow. Eternity is the light. Marcus's jaw tightened. The rhetorical ground beneath him was shifting again, the clarity of the Pope's words dissolving the fog of his accusation. Still, he searched for purchase, his mind clawing for the next attack. But then, he said quickly, why does it seem that every change you propose aligns with the very demands of those outside the Church? Why do your words sound like echoes of the culture rather than the guardianship of faith? The Pope turned his gaze toward Marcus, and for a moment it seemed he was not addressing a journalist but a soul stripped bare. His eyes held not anger but a searching sadness, the kind that sees deeper than words. Why does defending children unsettle you? He asked quietly. The question pierced the basilica like an arrow loosed in silence. Marcus blinked. The question had not been expected. It was not a defense, not a counterargument, it was an unveiling. It revealed the heart of the challenge itself. Why should the act of protecting innocence, of feeding the hungry, of lifting the broken, be cast as surrender? What is it in Marcus, in those who think like him, that makes compassion look like compromise? The Pope had turned the accusation into a mirror, forcing Marcus not only to attack but to confront himself. A murmur rippled across the hall. Some journalists lowered their pens, their brows furrowed in thought. Others exchanged glances, uncertain of what to write. A few nodded, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the force of the Pope's words. The division in the audience deepened, not between those who agreed and disagreed, but between those who felt exposed and those who felt invited. The Pope let the silence stretch, not as a void but as a revelation. Then he spoke again, his voice softer now, yet carrying greater weight. You ask me if I bend to culture. I ask you, Marcus, when Christ broke bread with sinners, was he endorsing their sin, or was he drawing them toward the light? You see concession where there is courage. You see compromise where there is compassion. But what you call weakness, heaven calls obedience. Marcus's lips parted, but no words came. The hall watched him, waiting, as though his silence was now louder than any question he could pose. His armor of confidence had cracked. His composure had faltered. The Pope did not gloat. There was no triumph in his eyes, no pride in his bearing. His voice, when it came again, was not sharp but pastoral, carrying the kind of clarity that redeems rather than humiliates. The danger is not in changing forms to carry the flame. The danger is in mistaking the form for the flame itself. The Mass must live, not as a relic in glass but as a fire in the hearts of men. That is not surrender. That is victory. And the one who cannot see this does not defend faith, he imprisons it. The basilica was still. No one clapped. No one jeered. The silence was total, and in that silence the shift was unmistakable. Marcus, once the aggressor, now looked diminished, his strength unraveling not by force but by the weight of unshakable truth. The narrator's voice leans in, guiding the audience through what they have witnessed. This was the redemption of wisdom over power. No yelling, no boasting, no humiliation. Only truth, spoken with grace, dismantling arrogance piece by piece until nothing remained but the question each listener had to face. And now, you who hear this, where do you stand? Do you see the difference between politics that fades and souls that endure? Do you hear the wisdom that does not bow to applause but bows only to Christ? If so, subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, so that such truth may continue to reach hearts unshaken. But if you will not, then write in the comments why you choose resistance, so that your refusal may not hide in silence. For in that hall, beneath the eyes of the world, wisdom had triumphed without spectacle, and truth had prevailed without pride. The challenger's arguments lay dismantled, not by aggression but by grace. And the Pope stood unshaken, not as a politician, not as a puppet, but as a witness. The basilica remained silent, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy pause before an answer, nor the tense suspension of conflict. This silence was the aftermath of truth, the air cleared of accusation, the weight of arguments dismantled. Marcus sat with his pen idle, his eyes lowered, his armor stripped not by force but by a grace he could not combat. The Pope did not lean into victory. He did not stand taller, nor allow triumph to sharpen his tone. Instead, his posture softened. His hands, folded upon the lectern, rested there gently, and when he spoke, his voice no longer burned with rebuke but glowed with warmth. The quiet fire that had answered accusation now became a flame of compassion. "My brothers and sisters," he said, his words not directed merely at Marcus or the press before him but at every soul watching across the world, "this is not about me. It is not about one journalist or one pope. It is about us, about what kind of church, what kind of world, we will choose to build together." The shift was unmistakable. The confrontation dissolved into communion. No longer was the hall a courtroom, it had become a sanctuary. The Pope's voice carried with it the timbre of a shepherd calling his flock, not to argue, but to remember who they were and who they were called to be. He continued, his tone like balm poured over the wounds the debate had opened. "Do not mistake our differences for divisions. Do not let fear of change blind you to the unchanging heart of our faith. The Mass is not being diminished. It is being renewed, so that it may speak again into the ears of a world that has grown deaf to sacred words. This is not about abandoning the old. It is about allowing the old to give birth to life again, as it has for centuries." Heads in the audience began to lower, not in shame but in reflection. Some reporters, hardened by years of skepticism, found themselves listening not as professionals but as people, as souls, confronted with something they did not expect, tenderness in place of pride. The Pope's eyes moved across the basilica as though they could reach through the cameras into the homes of those watching. "This is about humanity," he said. "It is about humility. It is about responsibility. We live in a time when voices are many and ears are few. A time when the world shouts but does not hear. But Christ did not come to shout louder than his enemies. He came to speak words that pierced the heart, words that demanded listening." The hall was utterly still. It was as though every soul had leaned forward, not in anticipation of debate but in the hunger to hear. The Pope paused, then lifted his hand slightly, not in command but in blessing. "We do not need more voices shouting. We need more hearts listening. Listening to one another. Listening to the cries of the poor, the broken, the forgotten. Listening above all to the voice of Christ, who still speaks, if only we would silence ourselves long enough to hear him." It was sermonic, yes, but it was also deeply human. There was no triumph, no arrogance. Only clarity. The Pope had turned the clash into a call, the battle into a benediction. Some in the basilica closed their eyes, their pens set aside. Others clasped their hands together, as though the ancient walls themselves had become a cathedral once more, not a stage. Even those who resisted, who remained unconvinced, found themselves quieted, disarmed not by force but by gentleness. Across the world, reactions varied. In some homes, tears fell as families whispered prayers, feeling as though a voice had reached into their living rooms with hope. In others, anger burned hotter, the Pope's words interpreted as cunning, as manipulation. Yet even among the scoffers, there was no denying the power of what had been spoken. For to deny the words was to admit that one had heard them. And now, the narrator's voice turns gently to you who listen, this is no longer debate. It is an invitation. What kind of world will you help build? One filled with voices shouting into the void, or one where hearts are humbled to listen? If you would join the listeners, then subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, and stand with those who choose humility over noise. But if you prefer the shouting, then write in the comments why you choose the noise, why you would rather add to the clamor than join the silence where truth is heard. For in that moment, Pope Leo XIV had done what few leaders of his age could do. He had turned confrontation into communion, accusation into blessing. And the basilica, once trembling with tension, now glowed with the strange peace that only follows when truth has spoken, not with anger, but with love. The basilica rested in a silence that was no longer tense, no longer heavy with conflict, but tender, reverent, and alive. Pope Leo XIV had spoken his final pastoral words, and though Marcus Valdez sat diminished and broken of composure, the pontiff's eyes no longer rested on him. The journalist had been the questioner, the provocateur, the challenger, but now he was no longer the center. The gaze of the Pope had widened, sweeping across the entire basilica, beyond the marble walls, beyond the cameras, reaching into every home, every phone screen, every corner of the world where eyes watched and ears listened. And then, with a voice softened yet sharpened by the weight of all that had passed, he posed a question. Not to Marcus, not to the reporters gathered in their pressed suits and tapping pens, but to the audience itself. To those who had sat quietly in the comfort of their living rooms, or leaned forward in buses, or listened secretly in workplaces. What would you have said if you were in this room? The question cut through the stillness, not as accusation, but as invitation. It forced every listener into the story. No one could remain a spectator now. The cameras captured the still face of the Pope, the light haloed faintly around him, his voice calm and steady, but it was not only the basilica that felt his question. Across continents, people froze, as if caught. Mothers stirring pots paused mid-motion. Commuters with earbuds stared blankly at their reflections in train windows. Priests in rectories, skeptics in apartments, politicians in offices, all felt as though the Pope's eyes had pierced through glass and screen and asked them directly, "What would you have said?" The brilliance of the question was not in its challenge to Marcus, but in its challenge to everyone else. The Pope had turned the confrontation into communion, had lifted the dialogue out of the marble hall and placed it in the conscience of the world. He had pressed the mirror to every soul. If you had been the one with the microphone, what truth or what arrogance would have left your lips? The basilica remained utterly still, as though the very walls listened for an answer. But there was no answer, not in words, not yet. Only reflection. The Pope leaned slightly closer, his voice low, intimate, reaching through the broadcast as though he now sat across the table from each listener. This is not about winning an argument. It is about winning back the silence of the heart, so that truth may be heard again. Each of you who listens must ask yourself, what kind of church, what kind of world, will you shape by your words, your choices, your silence? The narrator's voice, carrying the weight of the moment, lingers here. He had dismantled Marcus, yes, but now he dismantled the illusion of neutrality in everyone else. For in moments like these, there is no neutrality. Silence itself is a choice. And then, the invitation widened into engagement. If you have thoughts, speak them, the Pope continued. Let there be no fear in honest debate, no shame in questions asked with sincerity. Speak in your homes, speak in your hearts, speak even here, in this space where we listen together. Let us not fear disagreement, for disagreement is the soil where understanding may yet grow. But let us speak with respect, not rage. Let us argue with humility, not pride. And let us seek not to win, but to listen. The basilica was hushed, but millions across the world began to shift, stirred by the gentle command. Comment threads lit up not merely with rage or dismissal, but with questions, with prayers, with the beginnings of dialogue. The Pope had turned confrontation into communion, and communion into conversation. He paused, then lifted his hand in blessing. His voice carried the rhythm of a benediction, words chosen not for the journalist before him, but for the world beyond him. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. May we have the courage to listen, the grace to be silent when needed, and the wisdom to speak only what builds, never what destroys. May our faith not be a weapon to strike, but a fire to warm. And may Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, guide us into unity beyond the noise. The basilica seemed to glow faintly. Even skeptics felt something stir, even if they denied it. For blessing, when spoken in sincerity, carries weight whether one believes or not. And then, as the cameras drew close, the Pope delivered his final call, not for himself, not for applause, but for the message he bore. If these words stir you, if you long for a faith that listens more than it shouts, then join us. Subscribe to Circles of God's Glory, so that this flame may not be hidden, so that you may walk with us in the days to come. But if you will not, then let your refusal be known. Write it plainly, let it be seen, for silence in the face of truth is itself a confession. The challenge landed heavy. No longer could anyone hide behind anonymity or passivity. To subscribe was to stand. To refuse was to explain. Every viewer, every listener, was pressed into the confrontation, not as a spectator, but as participant. The narrator's voice, aligning itself with the weight of the moment, closes softly yet with firmness. Thus ended the encounter, not in shouting, not in humiliation, but in blessing and challenge. A pope stood unshaken. A journalist sat undone. And the world, divided and stirred, found itself confronted not only with words, but with a mirror. And so the final question echoes, across time, across distance, into your own heart. What would you have said if you were in that room?